So, why have millions of Mexicans immigrated to the United States over the last century? Well, the answer isn't just immigration, the answer revolves around the ever growing need of the U.S. labor demand. Throughout U.S. history, migration really has been shown to be affected by the ever growing need of the economic needs of this country. Throughout U.S. history, migration between Mexico and the United States has often been shaped by the needs of the American economy and Mexico's citizens coming over to help contribute to our economy.
Because of this relationship, migration patterns often increased during periods when American industries needed additional labor. Understanding these economic connections helps explain how migration between Mexico and the United States developed over time and why these patterns continue to shape migration today.
Better understand why Mexican American migration patterns look the way they do today, we have to look back at the expansion of both the U.S. territory and U.S. economy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It all began with the massive territorial shift that took place after the Mexican American War, as after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848, vast regions that were originally part of Mexico became part of the U.S. With this meant that all of the Mexicans living in those areas became part of the U.S. population overnight. Later on, as the American West began to industrialize, the demand for labor skyrocketed. Employers in the railroad, mining, and agriculture sectors weren't going to wait for people to come and work for them, so they actively hired Mexican laborers to fuel their growth. These early migrations became critical because they weren't just a temporary fix. They established a long-term migration network, an economic dependency that still defines the relationship between U.S. and Mexico today. Despite the Mexican workers now being the backbone of the U.S. economy, their work was often defined by systematic discrimination that faced every single Mexican worker. Not only was there a dual wage system, where often these Mexican workers were paid considerably less than the average white man, they also had considerably worse living conditions. When we take a deeper look at the living conditions and hardship these Mexican workers face, we often find ourselves at the heart of a company town. These were towns set up by companies that housed workers, but were often extremely segregated. Mexican workers also could not join normal labor unions. Despite this, though, they ended up forming mutualistas or mutual aid programs. These community led organizations acted as a pool of resources to help the average Mexican worker. Through this, we see that there's a history of self reliance and community that aimed to show that Mexican workers were never just a labor commodity, and that they were more active participants in shaping the United States than the average white man was.
One prime example of how U.S. policy has affected migration patterns and how the growing demand for labor has affected these patterns is the Bracero program. The Bracero program, dating back to 1942 at the beginning of World War II, was a program meant to solve the issue of Americans not being present during war times and the ever-growing need for labor in the agriculture business. Essentially, this was an agreement in which Mexican citizens would come over to the U.S., work temporarily in our farms, contribute to our agriculture business, and boost the economy. Mexico was under false pretenses and under false hope that this would actually modernize the work culture in Mexico and give opportunities to rural workers and improve relations with the US. However, it really did do the opposite and further pushed the narrative that this was the only path to success and that workers had to endure these conditions. And speaking of conditions, the worker conditions that they endured were very inhumane, with no access to restrooms, no breaks, very long work hours, extreme heat, constant exposure to pesticides, and constant violence, threats, and using deportation as a weapon against these workers as they weren't citizens here. This is proving that the Bracero program demonstrates how government policies really do affect the migration patterns within relation to the economic and labor need of our country.
Over time, Mexican migration expanded beyond traditional destinations like California and Texas. For much of the 20th century, these states were the primary places where Mexican migrants found work, especially in agriculture and seasonal farm labor. However, beginning in the late 20th century, migration patterns began to shift as new economic opportunities emerged in other parts of the country. Many migrants began moving to regions such as the Midwest and the southern United States, where industries like meatpacking, construction, and agriculture were growing rapidly and needed workers. Employers in these industries often recruited migrant labor to fill demanding jobs and maintain production. As a result, Mexican communities began to develop in places that had not historically had large Latino populations. Migration also expanded into the Pacific Northwest, including states like Washington and Oregon. This region attracted migrant workers because of its agricultural industries, particularly fruit and crop production. Despite the importance of this migration, scholars note that development of Mexican communities in the Pacific Northwest has often been overlooked in migration studies. Researchers such as Maldonado and Garcia have argued that migration to this region is significant but historically understudied. These migration patterns can also be understood through push and pull factors. Push factors include limited economic opportunities, lower wages, and economic instability in parts of Mexico. Pull factors include higher wages and greater job opportunities in the United States, particularly in industries experiencing labor shortages. Together, these economic pressures continue to shape where Mexican migrants move and where new communities form across the United States today. From early labor recruitment in agriculture and railroads to programs like the Bracero program and the growth of modern industries such as construction, meatpacking, and food production, Mexican workers have played a significant role in supporting economic development in the United States.
Understanding these concepts helps explain why migration continues today and why immigration also connects to labor demand and economic policy.
When we really pay close attention to the migration history of the US, we really notice how much these trends have shaped our US economy. At many points in history, migration has often increased with the American industry's need for additional workers. So after a thorough examination of the way in which Mexican immigrants come to our country to support our economy, do the jobs that Americans aren't really doing, and with new developing issues such as developing war, ongoing ICE raids and deportations, and just economic growth in general in our current times, how do we really think that this will affect our economic state of the country? And do we think that Americans will do the jobs that are going to be absent now if the immigration patterns are going to be absent, or if numbers are going to decrease in a way in relation with the ongoing ICE raids? Please let us know down in the comments.